Tonight we're not going to talk about the 1950s the way your history textbook did. No shiny diner booths, no soda pop optimism, no perfectly pressed shirts fresh off a Norman Rockwell canvas. Tonight we're going somewhere quieter, somewhere the porch light doesn't quite reach. The dark side of the 1950s American family. So if you're the kind of person who finds comfort in uncomfortable truths told slowly, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if you're okay with a bedtime story that occasionally makes you wince before it makes you yawn. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is right where you are. Then dim the lights, pull the blanket up, and let's step quietly behind the screen door of a house that looks perfect from the street. Let's pause here for a moment before we go inside. What did it actually cost to keep a home looking that flawless? Who paid the bill when a marriage was unhappy, but divorce was a scandal? Where did a woman go when the sadness had no name and no doctor would give her one? What happened to a man who came home from a war nobody wanted to discuss? And what happened to a family that simply didn't fit the picture on the cereal box? Tonight we're going to ask those questions slowly, gently, without judgment, and let the answers settle over you like static from an old radio left on in another room. This isn't a story meant to frighten you. It's a story meant to be true, and truth, even soft and drowsy, deserves to be told properly. You wake up in the year 1955, though nothing about the year matters as much as the address. A quiet street, freshly paved, lined with houses so alike you could lose your way home if you weren't careful. This is the after. After the war, after the Depression, after ration books and victory gardens and a decade of holding your breath. America has exhaled, and the exhale looks like a split-level house with a 2-car garage and a payment book that will follow you for the next 30 years. Everyone agreed or seemed to agree that this was the reward. Peace, prosperity, a lawn of your own. Nobody put in the fine print that the reward came with its own set of debts, the kind that don't show up on a bank statement. Let's start with the wedding, because that's where the story of the American family officially begins, at least on paper. A young woman in the 1950s was told, gently but constantly, that her diploma was a lovely accessory, but her real education was the one that ended in a ring. Colleges half-joked, and sometimes didn't joke at all, about young women attending in pursuit of what people called a Mrs. degree, the unofficial credential earned by finding a husband before graduation. Home economics classes taught budgeting, sewing, and the correct way to plan a week of dinners, not because these were beloved hobbies, but because a woman's future, in the eyes of most of the country, depended on how well she could run a household for someone else. If she reached her mid-20s unmarried, the whispers started. Something must be wrong with her. Too particular, too plain, too much personality for her own good. The pressure wasn't subtle and it wasn't kind. It simply arrived dressed as concern. For men, the pressure wore a different coat, but it was heavy all the same. A man was expected to have a steady job, a car, and a plan before he could seriously court anyone, because courtship in this era was, in its own quiet way, an economic transaction dressed up in flowers and Sunday drives. Falling behind on that timeline invited its own quiet suspicion. Was he odd? Was he simple? Was there something the neighbors weren't saying out loud? Marriage wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a certificate of normalcy, and in a decade so obsessed with looking normal, that certificate mattered more than almost anything else. Once the wedding happened, the real architecture of the marriage revealed itself, and for many couples, that architecture was built on very little actual knowledge of one another. Courtships were often short, chaperoned, and carefully staged to show only the most presentable version of each person. Long conversations about values, expectations, finances, or the kind of future each person actually wanted were, more often than not, skipped entirely in favor of assumptions borrowed from movies and magazines. People married the idea of a spouse more than the actual person sitting across the dinner table, and by the time the honeymoon photographs were tucked into an album, some of them were already quietly discovering just how large that gap could be. Let's talk about what a wife legally was in this era, because the word carries more weight than people remember. In many states, a married woman could not open a bank account in her own name without her husband's signature. She could not take out a loan, sign a lease, or in some places even get a credit card independently. Her legal identity, in the eyes of banks, courts, and often her own community, was folded into her husband's. If he left, if he drank away the paycheck, if he disappeared for a weekend and came back smelling like someone else's perfume, she often had very few independent resources to fall back on. This wasn't an unfortunate accident of the system. It was the system, built brick by brick specifically so that a woman's financial survival ran directly through her husband, and only her husband. Divorce existed technically, but it was treated less like a legal option and more like a moral failure with a paper trail. Many states required proof of fault, adultery, abandonment, or cruelty severe enough to be documented and defended in open court, where a woman's entire private life could be picked apart by lawyers and neighbors alike. Even in cities with slightly more lenient laws, the social cost of divorce was steep. A divorced woman was often treated as a cautionary tale at the very same bridge parties and church socials she'd attended for years as a happily married guest. Divorced men fared somewhat better socially, which tells you almost everything you need to know about whose reputation this system was actually built to protect. So what did people do instead of divorcing? Mostly, they stayed. They stayed in marriages that had gone cold, in marriages that had gone cruel, in marriages that had simply gone silent somewhere around year 4 or 5 and never found their way back. The phrase unhappily married wasn't a diagnosis in this decade. It was closer to a background hum, something so common it barely registered as remarkable. Neighbors knew. Everyone always knew, in that particular suburban way where knowledge is exchanged over fences in tones too polite to be called gossip, even though that's exactly what it was. But knowing wasn't the same as intervening, and intervening wasn't the same as helping. And so the marriages continued, dinner after dinner, decade after decade, held together by habit, obligation, and a very stubborn refusal to let the neighbors see any cracks in the plaster. Now let's step further into the house, because behind some of those closed doors, the silence wasn't just emotional. It was physical, and it was dangerous. Domestic violence in the 1950s did not have the vocabulary we use for it today. There was no widely recognized term for what happened when a husband raised his hand to his wife behind a locked bedroom door. Police, when they were called at all, which was rare, often treated it as exactly what the culture told them it was: a private family matter, not a crime. Officers were frequently instructed, formally or informally, to calm the household down and leave rather than make an arrest, because a marriage, however violent, was still considered sacred ground that the law was reluctant to cross. Women who sought help often found very few places to turn. Shelters as we understand them today did not exist in any meaningful, widespread way. A woman fleeing violence might go to her parents, if her parents were willing and able to take her in, which was not guaranteed, because plenty of families viewed a returning, unhappy daughter as an embarrassment rather than someone to protect. She might go to a church, where a sympathetic pastor could offer prayer and, if she was fortunate, quiet practical help, but just as often she'd be gently encouraged to go back home and try harder to be a better wife, as though her own safety were a problem to be solved through improved cooking or a softer tone of voice. The message, spoken or unspoken, was almost always the same. Marriage was permanent. Whatever happened inside, it was hers to manage. Children in these homes learned early to read the temperature of a room before they'd even fully learned to read a book. They learned which nights to disappear quietly to their bedrooms, which tone of voice meant trouble was building, which sounds through the wall meant it was safest to stay very, very still. Nobody explained what was happening to them, because there was no framework in this decade for explaining it. There was no word for a safe adult they could call, no hotline number pinned to the refrigerator, no school counselor trained to notice the particular quiet of a child who has learned to make himself small. They simply absorbed it, carried it forward, and in many cases repeated the same silence with their own children decades later. Because silence, once it takes root in a family, has a remarkable habit of outliving the people who first planted it. It's worth pausing here, gently, because I know this is meant to be something you drift off to, not something that keeps you awake staring at the ceiling. So take a slow breath. None of what we're describing tonight is meant to alarm you personally. It's history, settling over you the way a heavy blanket settles over a bed, weighing you down just enough to keep you still while your mind wanders somewhere quieter. We'll continue softening the edges as we go, moving from the house itself out into the wider street, the wider decade, the wider country that built this particular kind of quiet. Now let's talk about the woman standing at the kitchen counter at 2 in the afternoon, alone, dishes done, children at school, husband at work, house so clean it practically echoes. This was the moment magazines never showed you. The advertisements loved to depict her smiling, apron crisp, casserole in hand, radiant with the simple joy of a well-organized pantry. What they didn't depict was the particular flavor of loneliness that comes from spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day in near-total isolation, performing tasks that were considered too unimportant to discuss with anyone but too essential to ever actually finish. There was always another floor to mop, another shirt to iron, another meal to plan, and remarkably little of it ever felt like it added up to anything larger than itself. Betty Friedan, a journalist and researcher, would spend the back half of this decade quietly surveying women just like this one, women who had followed every instruction handed to them and still felt a persistent, nameless dissatisfaction they couldn't explain even to themselves. She would eventually publish her findings at the start of the next decade under a title that would become famous, describing what she called the problem that has no name. But in the 1950s itself, this feeling had no name because the culture had gone to considerable lengths to make sure it never needed one. A woman who felt unhappy in her role wasn't understood to be responding rationally to genuine isolation and lost opportunity. She was understood to be maladjusted, ungrateful, or simply unwell. And when she was unwell, the solution the era offered her came in a small bottle. Prescription tranquilizers, sedatives with brand names that sounded almost cheerful, were dispensed by doctors with startling frequency to housewives describing symptoms of what we would now likely recognize as anxiety or depression. The prescribing pattern itself tells a quiet story. Men experiencing similar symptoms were more often encouraged toward rest, toward hobbies, toward simply toughening up, while women were far more readily medicated, as though her distress were a chemical inconvenience to be smoothed over rather than a reasonable response to a genuinely narrow and isolating life. These pills were shared at bridge clubs the way recipes were shared, traded quietly between friends who understood each other's fatigue better than any doctor ever could, and nobody involved really had the language to call it what it often was, which was a whole generation of women being quietly sedated into compliance with a role that was slowly hollowing them out. Let's step outside now, out past the kitchen window, onto the very lawn that so many families spent their Saturdays defending. Because the sameness of these neighborhoods, the sameness that felt so safe to some, was not an accident. It was engineered. Suburban developments of this era were frequently built under restrictive covenants, legal agreements attached directly to property deeds that explicitly barred the sale of homes to black families, Jewish families, and other groups deemed undesirable by the developers and, frankly, by many of the residents themselves. The most famous of these developments became case studies in a much larger pattern practiced across the country, where builders and banks worked in careful coordination to keep entire communities racially and religiously homogeneous. Even after the Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that these covenants could not be enforced by courts, informal versions of the same exclusion continued for years through a quieter, more deniable set of tools. Redlining was one of those tools. A practice in which federal housing agencies literally drew colored lines on maps to indicate which neighborhoods were considered safe for mortgage lending and which were not. Neighborhoods with significant black populations were almost universally marked in red, the lowest and riskiest category, regardless of the actual financial stability of the families living there. This meant that even a black family with excellent credit and steady income would often be denied a mortgage simply because of where they were trying to buy, while a white family with far shakier finances could walk into the very same bank and walk out with keys. The result was a suburb built not just on lawns and lumber, but on a foundation of deliberate exclusion, one that would shape the racial geography of American cities for generations afterward, long after the actual maps had been quietly retired. Realtors played their own part in maintaining this order, sometimes through outright refusal to show homes to black buyers in certain areas, and sometimes through a subtler practice that came to be known as blockbusting, in which agents would deliberately stoke white homeowners' fears that a black family moving into the neighborhood would send property values collapsing, encouraging panic sales at low prices, which the agents would then resell to black families at inflated prices, profiting on both ends of a fear they had manufactured themselves. Meanwhile, the language used by the neighbors themselves rarely sounded cruel on its surface. Words like stability, tradition, and the right kind of people did the work that more overtly hateful language might have made too uncomfortable to say out loud at a dinner party. This was prejudice wearing its most respectable clothes, and it fit the decade perfectly. We'll keep going slowly, and I'll pause the story again in a little while so you have a chance to rest if you need it. For now, let's stay a little longer on this street, because there's more happening behind these front doors than the postcard version of the decade ever let on. Consider, for a moment, the veterans living on this very block. Men in their late 20s and 30s who, only a handful of years earlier, had been standing in fields in France or islands in the Pacific, watching things no textbook description could ever properly prepare a person for. They came home to ticker tape parades, good jobs waiting for them through the GI Bill, and an unspoken but very firm expectation that they would simply resume civilian life, as though none of it had happened. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist yet in any clinical, widely recognized sense. What we now understand as a well-documented psychological injury was, in this decade, often dismissed as shell shock, a phrase already considered old-fashioned and slightly embarrassing by the 1950s, or simply as a man's own private weakness to manage quietly and never mention again, so they didn't mention it. They went to the office, they mowed the lawn, they built model trains in the garage late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and if the nightmares got loud enough that a wife noticed, the conversation, if it happened at all, was brief and awkward, and usually ended with both parties agreeing silently never to bring it up again. Alcohol filled a great deal of the space that therapy might have filled today. The evening cocktail, so charmingly depicted in every advertisement of the era, wasn't only a symbol of post-war leisure. For a significant number of households, it was a coping mechanism deployed nightly, sometimes multiple times nightly, by men and women both, to blur the edges of feelings that the culture had given them absolutely no other outlet to express. Alcoholism itself carried enormous stigma, which meant it was rarely named directly even when everyone on the street quietly understood exactly what was happening at the Hendersons' house every Friday night. A father who drank too much was often described, delicately, as having a bit of a temper or trouble sleeping, euphemisms soft enough to preserve the family's reputation while doing absolutely nothing to address the actual problem sitting at the head of the dinner table. Alcoholics Anonymous existed and was growing during this decade, offering one of the only structured, somewhat destigmatized paths toward help, but reaching that meeting still required a level of admission, of saying the actual words out loud in front of strangers, that many men in this era were simply never taught how to do. Let's slow down again for a moment, because this next part deserves a gentle approach. Not every family in the 1950s looked like the one on the cereal box, and not every person living inside one of these households fit neatly into the roles the decade insisted on. for anyone who was gay or lesbian, and for anyone whose gender identity didn't match the rigid expectations of the era. The 1950s American family could be one of the most dangerous, suffocating places imaginable, not despite its wholesome reputation, but often because of it. Homosexuality during this decade was not simply frowned upon. It was criminalized in the vast majority of states, treated by much of the medical establishment as a mental illness to be cured rather than an identity to be lived, and treated by the federal government, quite explicitly, as a security risk. The early years of this decade saw a systematic campaign, sometimes referred to by historians as the Lavender Scare, running alongside the more famous political witch hunts of the era, in which thousands of federal employees suspected of being gay or lesbian were investigated, interrogated, and dismissed from their jobs, their careers and reputations destroyed on nothing more than suspicion or rumor. This wasn't a fringe policy tucked away in some forgotten corner of government. It was pursued with real institutional energy, treated as seriously as any other Cold War security concern, because homosexuality was framed, absurdly and cruelly, as a form of moral weakness that could supposedly make a person vulnerable to blackmail and betrayal. Inside actual households, this meant that a son or daughter who felt even a flicker of difference from what was expected learned very quickly, often before they had the words to fully understand what they were feeling, that this particular truth about themselves was one that could never, under any circumstances, be spoken at the family dinner table. Some married the opposite sex anyway, building entire decades of family life around a secret so carefully guarded that even their own spouses sometimes never fully understood the shape of what was missing. Others left home as early as they possibly could, drawn toward the handful of cities, certain neighborhoods in places like New York and San Francisco, where a quiet, coded, underground community had begun to take shape in bars and private gatherings that could be raided by police at almost any moment, arrests and public exposure a constant, looming threat. Being outed in this decade could mean losing a job, a family, a place to live, and in the era's own newspapers, sometimes even one's name printed in connection with a morals charge, a public shamming with consequences that could follow a person for the rest of their life. We'll rest here for just a moment before continuing further into the decade. I want you to notice how your body feels right now, heavy in the mattress, breathing slower than when we started. That's exactly where I want you. We still have a great deal of ground to cover tonight. The quiet cruelty of the era's classrooms, the segregated hospitals that decided whose pain mattered and whose didn't, the children who disappeared into institutions nobody discussed afterward, and the long, slow unraveling that would eventually crack the postcard image wide open by the end of the decade. But for now, let your eyes rest, let the weight of the evening settle over you, and know that the story will still be here, waiting quietly whenever you're ready to continue. Let's continue where we left off, easing back into the quiet of that same street, the same decade, the same houses that looked so certain of themselves from the sidewalk. Settle back in. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. We're going to move a little deeper into the architecture of this era now, into the schools, the hospitals, the institutions that shaped a family's life just as much as anything happening behind their own front door. Let's start with the classroom, because so much of what a 1950s childhood actually looked like was decided long before a child ever sat down at the kitchen table for dinner. School in this decade was not simply a place of learning. It was a place of sorting, quietly and efficiently, deciding who belonged where, who deserved which opportunities, and who would spend a lifetime absorbing the message that they were somehow less than the child sitting beside them. For black children across much of the country, this sorting was not subtle at all. It was written into law. In 17 states and the District of Columbia, segregated schooling was not just common practice but a legal requirement, upheld for decades under the doctrine of separate but equal, a phrase that promised parity and delivered almost none. Black schools, as a rule, received a fraction of the funding of white schools in the same districts. Textbooks were frequently hand-me-downs, arriving years out of date, sometimes with the names of white students still written inside the front cover from whatever school had used them first, before passing them along once they were considered too worn or outdated for their original students. Buildings went without proper heating in winter. Buses, when they existed for black students at all, were often older, less reliable, and required far longer routes than the buses serving white children living in the very same county. This was the reality until 1954, when the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education declared that segregated schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional, a decision that should have changed everything overnight and instead changed almost nothing for years. Many school districts across the South responded not with compliance but with open defiance, delaying integration through legal maneuvering, through the closure of public schools entirely rather than integrate them, through what came to be called massive resistance, a coordinated, unapologetic refusal by state governments to follow federal law. It would take until the very end of this decade and well into the next, with federal troops sometimes required simply to escort children into buildings they had every legal right to enter, before integration became anything more than a promise on paper for most black families. And for the children living through this, the ones actually walking those hallways, the cost wasn't abstract or historical. It was daily, physical, and personal. It looked like being escorted to school past screaming adults, past signs and slurs that no child should ever have to walk past on their way to a math class. It looked like being seated in the back of overcrowded classrooms with teachers stretched impossibly thin, expected to somehow deliver the same education, with a fraction of the resources their white counterparts took for granted. It looked like understanding, at an age far too young to carry such an understanding, that the country you lived in had already decided, before you'd even learned to read, how much of a future it was willing to offer you. Native American children faced their own particular version of institutional cruelty during this decade, one that took place largely outside the public eye. Federal policy throughout the 1950s continued to push what was euphemistically called assimilation, which in practice often meant removing Native children from their families and placing them in boarding schools, sometimes hundreds of miles from their reservations, where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages, forced to cut their hair, given English names to replace the ones their families had chosen for them, and punished, sometimes severely, for any expression of the culture they'd been raised in. This wasn't a relic of some earlier century quietly winding down. It was active federal policy throughout this very decade, continuing a project of cultural erasure that had been underway for generations and would leave scars in Native communities that are still being reckoned with today. Let's turn now toward the hospital, because the same lines drawn through neighborhoods and school districts were drawn just as firmly through medicine. Segregated hospitals were the norm across much of the country, not just in the South but in cities throughout the nation, where black patients were frequently denied admission to white hospitals altogether or relegated to separate, chronically underfunded wings with fewer doctors, fewer beds, and markedly worse outcomes. Black physicians, even highly qualified ones, were routinely barred from practicing at white hospitals, denied admitting privileges regardless of their training, which meant that even a black doctor treating a black patient often had nowhere adequate to actually admit that patient if their condition required hospitalization. Maternal care reflected this divide with particular cruelty. Black mothers in this decade faced maternal mortality rates dramatically higher than white mothers, a gap driven not by any difference in biology but by profound differences in access, in the quality of prenatal care available, in whether a hospital would even admit a black woman in labor without delay or argument. Infant mortality followed the same grim pattern. These were not mysterious statistical anomalies to the doctors and public health officials of the era. They were the direct, measurable, and largely unaddressed consequence of a healthcare system built explicitly around exclusion. Mental health care, for every race and background, carried its own dark corners in this decade, though the specifics shifted depending on who was seeking help and why. State psychiatric hospitals across the country were, in a great many cases, dangerously overcrowded, understaffed, and operating with treatment philosophies that ranged from outdated to outright harmful by any modern standard. The lobotomy, a surgical procedure severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe, reached the height of its popularity in America during this very decade, performed on tens of thousands of patients, a disproportionate number of them women, for conditions ranging from genuine severe psychiatric illness to what doctors of the era vaguely described as difficult or unmanageable behavior. Women institutionalized by husbands or fathers for behavior that we would today recognize as ordinary defiance, depression, or simply the exhaustion of an unhappy marriage sometimes underwent this irreversible procedure, emerging permanently altered, flattened, compliant in a way that the era seemed to prize far more than it prized her actual well-being. Electroconvulsive therapy, too, was administered widely during this period, sometimes without the anesthesia, muscle relaxants, or careful oversight that make the modern version of this treatment far safer and more humane. For some patients, it offered genuine relief from severe depression that nothing else had touched. For others, particularly those institutionalized against their will or without full understanding of what was happening to them, it was simply one more procedure performed on a body that the era had decided did not fully belong to the person living inside it. Let's shift now to a quieter, more private kind of institution, the maternity homes that dotted cities and towns across the country, though few people spoke openly about their actual purpose. These homes existed to receive a very specific kind of resident, young, unmarried, and pregnant. In a decade that treated a wedding ring as the only acceptable gateway into motherhood, a pregnancy outside of marriage was considered not just a personal misfortune, but a genuine family emergency, one requiring concealment above almost anything else. Families who could manage it would often send a daughter away for the final months of her pregnancy, sometimes to stay with a distant relative, sometimes to one of these maternity homes specifically, under a cover story crafted for the neighbors, a semester abroad, an extended visit to a sick aunt, anything plausible enough to explain a months-long absence without ever mentioning the actual reason. Inside these homes, young women, some barely more than children themselves, were frequently pressured, and in many documented cases outright coerced, into surrendering their bodies for adoption immediately after birth, sometimes without ever being allowed to hold the child, sometimes having signed paperwork they only partially understood, presented to them at the most vulnerable, exhausted moment imaginable. The prevailing belief of the era held that this was simply the practical, sensible solution, that the child would have a better life with a married couple, that the young mother would be able to return home and resume her life as though none of it had happened, free of the stigma that an unmarried birth would otherwise follow her with for years. What this belief rarely accounted for was the grief. Decades later, many of these women, by then grandmothers themselves, would describe a loss that had never actually been allowed to be grieved at the time, a wound that the culture had insisted didn't exist because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging that something had gone wrong with the tidy, wholesome story the decade told about itself. Some searched for the children they'd been told to forget for the rest of their lives. Some found them. Many never did. Let's rest here for a moment gently before we continue. I know some of tonight's story sits heavier than a typical bedtime tale, and that's all right. History doesn't always arrive softly, but the telling of it can still be soft, can still be something you let wash over you like a low tide instead of something that keeps you gripping the shore. Breathe slowly. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go loose against the blanket. We still have more of this decade left to walk through together, the quiet epidemic of childhood polio that terrified every household on every street regardless of income or color, the culture of corporal punishment that shaped classrooms and kitchens alike, the slow cracks that would eventually split the whole postcard image apart by the decade's final years. But for now, rest here a while. The story will be waiting exactly where we left it. Let's settle back in. Pull the blanket a little higher. Let your eyes go soft and unfocused, and let's step back onto that same quiet street, because there's still so much of this decade left to walk through together before the night is done. Let's talk about fear first, the kind that had nothing to do with the Soviet Union or the bomb shelter in the basement, the kind that arrived instead every summer with the heat, uninvited, unstoppable, and utterly indiscriminate about which family it visited. Polio was, for much of this decade, the thing that kept parents awake long after their children had fallen asleep, and unlike so many of the era's anxieties, this one wasn't abstract or political. It was medical, it was immediate, and it could reach into any household on any street regardless of how well that household kept its lawn or its reputation. Every summer, without fail, the fear would rise with the temperature. Polio seemed to spread more easily in warm weather, though nobody understood exactly why at the time, and public health officials, doctors, and parents alike watched the calendar with a kind of dread that's difficult to fully appreciate now, in an age where the disease has been all but erased from public memory. Swimming pools, those gleaming symbols of post-war suburban leisure, would close entirely at the first sign of an outbreak in a community, sometimes for the entire season. Movie theaters, another beloved pillar of 1950s family life, would see attendance drop sharply the moment local health departments confirmed new cases nearby. Mothers who had spent the earlier parts of the decade fretting over table manners and ironed collars now found themselves fretting over something far more consequential, whether it was safe to let a child play outside at all, whether a public drinking fountain might be a source of contagion, whether the family should simply stay indoors until the season passed. The disease itself was cruel in its unpredictability. Most people infected with the poliovirus showed no symptoms whatsoever, which made the whole ordeal even more unsettling, because there was no way to know who was carrying it and who wasn't. But for a small, devastating percentage of those infected, the virus attacked the nervous system directly, sometimes causing temporary weakness, sometimes causing permanent paralysis, and in the most severe cases, paralyzing the muscles required for breathing itself. This last outcome led to one of the most haunting images of the entire decade: hospital wards lined with iron lungs, enormous metal cylinders that encased a patient's entire body below the neck, mechanically forcing air in and out of lungs that could no longer manage the task on their own. Children as young as 5 or 6 spent months, sometimes years, sometimes the remainder of their lives, inside these machines, able to see the world only through a small mirror angled above their heads, reflecting the ceiling and whatever visitors came to sit beside them. Parents in this decade developed rituals around polio, not unlike the rituals other families developed around nuclear anxiety, a kind of everyday vigilance dressed up as ordinary caution. Children were told to wash their hands obsessively, to avoid crowds during the summer months, to come inside the moment they felt tired or achy, because early symptoms could resemble nothing more than a mild summer cold right up until the moment they became something far worse. A limp that lingered a day too long, a fever that seemed slightly more stubborn than usual. These small details could send a household into a state of genuine panic, a trip to the doctor conducted with the kind of held breath usually reserved for far graver occasions. The relief, when it finally arrived, came in the form of a needle. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was declared safe and effective after a massive nationwide field trial involving well over 1 million American schoolchildren, and the announcement was met with a kind of public celebration that's genuinely hard to overstate. Church bells rang in some towns. Factory whistles blew. Strangers wept openly in the streets, embraced people they had never met, because for the first time in living memory, one of the era's deepest and most democratic fears, a fear that touched wealthy families and poor families alike, had a real, tangible solution. Parents lined up for blocks at school gymnasiums and community centers to have their children vaccinated, an image of collective relief that stood in sharp contrast to almost every other anxiety this decade quietly nursed behind closed doors. And yet, even this triumph carried its own dark footnote. Just months after the vaccine's release, a manufacturing error at one particular laboratory resulted in a batch of vaccine that contained live, improperly inactivated virus rather than the safely deactivated version intended for distribution. This incident, which came to be known as the Cutter incident, named for the laboratory responsible, resulted in tens of thousands of children contracting polio directly from the very vaccine meant to protect them, with dozens left paralyzed and several children losing their lives. It was a sobering, painful reminder that even in an era so eager to project confidence in science and progress, that progress remained fragile, imperfect, and capable of devastating families who had done everything asked of them and trusted the system completely. Let's shift now to another quiet corner of the era's family life, one that lived not in hospital wards, but in the ordinary rhythm of daily discipline. Corporal punishment in the 1950s was not the exception. It was the expectation, practiced openly and without much hesitation in homes, schools, and even churches across the country, treated less as a controversial choice and more as simply what responsible parenting and teaching looked like. At home, the tools varied by household. A wooden spoon kept deliberately visible in a kitchen drawer, a belt removed from a father's own waist in the middle of a lecture, a hairbrush, a switch cut fresh from a backyard tree if the offense seemed to warrant it. Spanking, and often harsher forms of physical punishment beyond a simple spanking, were widely regarded not as a last resort, but as a first and entirely appropriate response to a child's misbehavior, disrespect, or simple childish clumsiness. The phrase "spare the rod and spoil the child," borrowed loosely from scripture and repeated endlessly across the decade, functioned as both explanation and justification, a shorthand that closed off any real conversation about whether there might be a better way. Popular parenting advice of the era occupied a strange and shifting middle ground on this question. Dr. Benjamin Spock's enormously influential book on childcare, first published in the previous decade and revised throughout this one, actually encouraged parents toward warmth, flexibility, and a more relationship-centered approach to raising children, a genuine departure from the rigid, almost military scheduling advice that had dominated earlier decades. Yet even Spock's more progressive guidance existed alongside, and was often overshadowed by, a broader cultural insistence that children required firm physical correction to grow into disciplined, respectable adults. Many parents who might have gravitated toward gentler methods still felt enormous social pressure to spank, worried that a neighbor or relative witnessing a child's misbehavior go uncorrected might quietly judge the household as too soft, too permissive, too likely to raise a delinquent. Schools mirrored this culture with striking consistency. Paddling was a standard, legally sanctioned form of discipline in public schools across the vast majority of states, administered by principals, and in some districts by classroom teachers directly, often in front of the rest of the class as both punishment and public deterrent. A wooden paddle, sometimes drilled with holes to reduce air resistance and increase the sting of the blow, might hang visibly in a principal's office, a quiet, constant reminder of the consequences awaiting any student who stepped out of line. Parents were rarely notified in advance, and in most communities, parental consent wasn't required at all. A child could be paddled at school for offenses as minor as talking out of turn, chewing gum, or failing to complete an assignment, and would then return home that same evening to a family dinner table where the incident, if it came up at all, was more likely to result in a second punishment than any sympathy, because questioning a teacher's authority was, in itself, considered a form of disrespect. The psychological effects of this culture, though largely unexamined and unnamed at the time, ran deep and quiet beneath the surface of countless ordinary households. Children learned, often before they'd learned much else about the world, that love and pain could coexist within the very same relationship, that the people responsible for their safety were also the people most likely to cause them physical harm, and that this arrangement was not just normal but righteous, evidence of a parent who cared enough to correct rather than a parent who had simply lost their temper. This lesson, absorbed silently in childhood, would shape how an entire generation approached parenting, discipline, and even their own emotional lives well into adulthood, a quiet inheritance passed from household to household with remarkably little question. Let's turn, gently, toward something slightly different now, the particular loneliness experienced by children who didn't fit the mold this decade had built for them, not through any fault or circumstance of race or sexuality, but simply through difference itself. A child with what we would today recognize as a learning disability, an intellectual disability, autism, or any number of conditions that simply didn't have accurate diagnostic language yet in this era, often found themselves labeled in ways that were, by any modern standard, breathtakingly cruel. Words like slow, simple, or far harsher terms still in common usage at the time were applied casually, sometimes by teachers, sometimes even by well-meaning relatives, with little understanding of the actual neurological or developmental reality underneath. Families facing a child with significant disabilities were frequently counseled, sometimes quite directly by their own doctors, to consider institutionalization, to place the child in one of the large state-run facilities that existed across the country for exactly this purpose. These institutions, in a great many documented cases, provided care that fell devastatingly short of anything resembling dignity, let alone genuine treatment or education. Overcrowding was common. Staffing was thin. Some of these facilities, investigated more thoroughly by journalists and reformers in later decades, would be revealed to have subjected residents, children among them, to conditions of neglect and abuse so severe they're difficult to describe even now. Parents who chose institutionalization, often under significant social and even medical pressure, were frequently encouraged to visit rarely if at all, told that a clean break was best for everyone, that the child would adjust more easily without the ongoing presence of a family that would only complicate the transition. Other families made the opposite choice, keeping a disabled child at home, but even this choice came wrapped in its own particular isolation. There was little in the way of specialized education available in most public schools. There was little in the way of public understanding or accommodation. A family raising a child with visible differences often found themselves quietly excluded from the very same social fabric. The bridge clubs, the PTA gatherings, the block parties, that defined so much of suburban belonging in this decade, not through any official policy, but through the simple, steady accumulation of 1,000 small, awkward silences and unreturned invitations. Let's rest again for just a moment, because I can feel, even through the quiet of this recording, how much ground we've covered together tonight. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of everything we've discussed settle rather than press. This decade, for all its postcard smiles, carried an enormous amount of quiet weight on the shoulders of the people actually living inside it. And it's all right to feel that weight a little yourself right now, here in the dark, safe under your own blankets, decades removed from any of it. We still have more to cover before the night is through, the labor movement simmering quietly beneath the era's economic prosperity, the beginnings of the civil rights movement stirring in churches and living rooms across the South, the small acts of quiet resistance that would eventually crack this whole carefully polished decade wide open. But for now, let it rest. We'll pick the thread back up together very soon. Let's ease back in once more. Settle deeper into the pillow, let the last of the evening's tension drain from your shoulders, and let's return to that same quiet street, because the story isn't finished, not by a long way. There's still a great deal of this decade left to walk through together, slowly, patiently, the way we've been doing all night. Let's start tonight with something that rarely made it into the glossy magazine spreads of the era: the factory floor, the loading dock, the assembly line, because for all the talk of post-war prosperity, that prosperity was neither evenly distributed nor easily won. It had to be fought for, meeting by meeting, contract by contract, often at real personal cost to the men and women doing the fighting. The 1950s are often remembered, correctly in some respects, as a golden age for the American worker, a decade when a single factory paycheck could genuinely support a family, buy a house, put a car in the driveway, and still leave a little left over for a summer vacation. This was real, and it mattered enormously, but it hadn't simply appeared out of post-war goodwill. It was the direct result of decades of labor organizing that had come before, strikes and negotiations and hard-won contracts stretching back through the Depression and before, and it required constant, ongoing vigilance throughout this decade to maintain and protect. Labor unions in this era held genuine power, membership numbers reaching their historic peak, roughly a third of the American workforce belonging to a union by the middle of the decade. The United Auto Workers, the United Steelworkers, and dozens of other major unions had, over years of difficult negotiation, secured things that had been unthinkable a generation earlier: reliable pensions, employer-sponsored health insurance, paid vacation time, and wages that actually kept pace with the cost of living. This was the invisible scaffolding holding up the entire suburban dream we've spent so much of tonight describing. The split-level house, the two-car garage, the appliance-filled kitchen, all of it rested, more often than most families probably realized, on the shoulders of a labor movement working quietly in the background to keep wages high enough to make that dream affordable. But this decade also carried its own particular threat to that movement, one born directly out of the era's obsession with anti-communism. The Taft-Hartley Act, passed in the previous decade but enforced with real teeth throughout this one, required union leaders to sign affidavits swearing they were not communists, restricted certain kinds of strikes considered too disruptive to national interests, and gave employers new tools to push back against organizing efforts. Union leaders and members who had genuine, sometimes decades-old ties to left-wing political movements, some dating back to Depression-era organizing when communist and socialist ideas had far more mainstream currency within the labor movement, now found themselves under direct suspicion, sometimes called before congressional committees, sometimes blacklisted from their own industries entirely. Their years of organizing work erased from their resume by a single accusation that was often impossible to disprove. This atmosphere of suspicion reached into ordinary workplaces in ways that rarely made the history books but shaped daily life on the shop floor all the same. A worker who spoke too passionately about better conditions, who organized too effectively, who read the wrong newspaper or attended the wrong meeting years earlier, could find themselves quietly reported, investigated, sometimes fired under a pretext that had nothing officially to do with their politics, but everything to do with them underneath. The chilling effect was real and lasting, teaching an entire generation of workers that even legitimate, protected organizing activity carried genuine personal risk if it drew too much attention from the wrong people. And even at its strongest, this era of labor prosperity had very real boundaries drawn around who got to benefit from it. Many of the most significant labor protections, particularly those established even earlier under New Deal legislation, had been deliberately written to exclude agricultural and domestic workers, categories of labor disproportionately filled by Black Americans, particularly in the South, a compromise made decades earlier to secure the votes of segregationist lawmakers who refused to support any law that might improve the economic standing of black workers relative to white ones. This meant that a black woman working as a domestic servant in a white household, one of the most common forms of employment available to black women in this decade, had no legal right to a minimum wage, no protection against being fired without cause, no guaranteed day of rest, nothing beyond whatever informal arrangement she'd managed to negotiate with her employer, an arrangement that could be altered or ended entirely on a moment's notice with no recourse whatsoever. Let's move now towards something stirring quietly beneath the surface of this decade, something that would not stay quiet for very much longer. In churches across the South, in living rooms, in the back pews and basement meeting halls of black communities from Alabama to Virginia, a movement was taking shape throughout this decade, one that the country at large would not fully reckon with until its final years, though it had been building steadily the entire time. Rosa Parks did not, as the simplified version of this story often suggests, spontaneously decide one December evening in 1955 to remain seated on a Montgomery bus out of simple, isolated exhaustion. She was, in fact, a longtime NAACP organizer, trained specifically in nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Folk School earlier that same year, part of a community that had been carefully, patiently laying the groundwork for exactly this kind of moment for years. Her arrest that evening became the spark for the Montgomery bus boycott, a coordinated, sustained protest that would stretch on for 381 days, an entire black community organizing carpools, walking miles to work rather than ride a segregated bus system, sustaining an economic and moral pressure campaign of remarkable discipline and endurance, led in significant part by a young minister new to the city named Martin Luther King Jr., whose role in that boycott would launch him into the national spotlight for the first time. The boycott succeeded eventually, when the Supreme Court ruled Montgomery's segregated bus system unconstitutional at the very end of 1956, but success came at real, immediate cost to the ordinary people who had sustained it. Boycott leaders and participants faced harassment, arrest on flimsy or fabricated charges, and outright violence throughout the entire campaign. King's own home was bombed during the boycott. His wife and infant daughter inside at the time, though thankfully unharmed. This was the texture of quiet resistance in the 1950s South, courage exercised not in a single dramatic moment, but sustained, day after weary day, against a system willing to use real violence to protect itself. Elsewhere in the South, individual families took on their own quiet, dangerous forms of resistance simply by insisting on rights the law was theoretically supposed to already guarantee them. In Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, 9 black teenagers, who would come to be known to history as the Little Rock Nine, attempted simply to attend the high school in their own city, a school they had every legal right to enroll in following the Brown decision 3 years earlier. They were met by a mob, by the Arkansas National Guard deployed by the state's own governor specifically to block their entry, and it would ultimately require federal troops, dispatched by President Eisenhower himself, reluctant as he was to intervene, to escort these teenagers safely into a building that was, on paper, already theirs to attend. These were 15, 16, 17-year-old children, ordinary teenagers with ordinary teenage lives, thrust into a national spotlight and a genuinely dangerous situation simply for wanting an equal education, spending that entire school year enduring harassment, physical assault, and constant threats from fellow students and adults alike, protected by soldiers because their own community had proven itself unwilling to protect them any other way. Emmett Till's story belongs here too, though it's one of the hardest to tell gently. In the summer of 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, visiting relatives in Mississippi, was accused, on grounds that would later be revealed as substantially fabricated, of behaving inappropriately toward a white woman in a local store. Days later, he was abducted from his Grey-Tunkle's home in the middle of the night, beaten, and murdered. His body so severely disfigured that his mother, upon its return to Chicago, made the deliberate, courageous decision to hold an open casket funeral, insisting that the world see exactly what had been done to her son. Photographs of his body were published in black newspapers and magazines across the country, and the image, along with the acquittal of his murderers by an all-white jury who deliberated for barely over an hour, became a catalyst that galvanized a generation of civil rights activists, many of whom would later cite this single case as the moment they understood, with total clarity, exactly what they were up against. These stories moved through black communities in this decade, through channels the wider white culture rarely saw or acknowledged: church bulletins, black-owned newspapers with circulations far larger than most white Americans realized, word passed carefully between trusted neighbors, a whole parallel information network operating quietly beneath the version of America that made it into the mainstream press. Resistance in this decade rarely looked like the dramatic, unified marches that would come to define the following decade's most iconic images. It looked instead like this: patient, dangerous, sustained by ordinary people who went to work the next morning anyway, who sent their children to school the next morning anyway, who kept organizing quietly in church basements even after a cross had been burned on someone's lawn the night before. Let's turn our attention now to a different kind of quiet cracking, one happening not along racial lines, but within the white suburban households we've spent so much of tonight examining directly. Because even inside the homes that most benefited from this decade's particular arrangement of power, cracks were beginning to show by the era's final years, small but unmistakable signs that the postcard image wasn't holding together quite as seamlessly as its architects had hoped. Popular culture itself began, almost accidentally, to give voice to a discontent that had been quietly building for years. Films examined the emptiness lurking beneath suburban conformity, following a man who returns from the war only to find that outward success, the gray flannel suit, the steady job, the house in the suburbs, feels hollow and unsatisfying in ways he struggles to articulate even to himself. Novels of the era increasingly explored similar territory, the quiet desperation of men who had done everything asked of them and still felt something essential was missing, of marriages that looked perfect from the street and felt like slow suffocation from the inside. These weren't fringe, underground works. Many of them were genuine mainstream commercial successes, suggesting that a significant portion of the audience recognized something true and uncomfortable in these portrayals, something closer to their own experience than the cheerful advertisements running in the very same magazines that reviewed these books and films. Rock and roll music, dismissed by many parents as a passing fad or worse, a genuine moral threat, gave teenagers across the country their first real taste of a culture separate from their parents, one built around rhythms and energy that felt deliberately, thrillingly at odds with the careful, controlled orderliness of the adult world they were expected to inherit. Elvis Presley's television appearances, famously filmed from the waist up on certain broadcasts specifically, because his hip movements were considered too suggestive for a family audience, became a genuine flashpoint in a broader cultural anxiety about where exactly this younger generation was headed, and whether the values so carefully instilled at Sunday dinner tables across the country would actually survive contact with a wider world that seemed to be changing faster than most parents were prepared for. Meanwhile, quietly, in psychology offices and academic journals that most ordinary families never read, researchers were beginning to publish findings that would eventually upend some of the decade's most cherished assumptions. Studies on child development were beginning to question whether the rigid, schedule-obsessed parenting advice of earlier decades had actually served children well at all. Early research into what would later be more fully understood as anxiety and depression was beginning, tentatively, to suggest that these conditions were not simply personal failings or feminine weakness, but genuine, treatable medical realities affecting men and women in roughly comparable numbers. A finding that directly contradicted the prevailing cultural assumption that had shaped so much of the pill-popping, tranquilized domesticity we discussed earlier tonight. By the very end of the decade, the cracks that had been forming quietly for years were becoming difficult for even the most committed defenders of the status quo to fully ignore. The economic prosperity that had defined the decade's opening years was beginning to show signs of real strain by its close. A recession settling over parts of the country, layoffs reaching even some of the union workers who had felt so secure just a few years earlier. The civil rights movement that had spent the decade building its foundation in church basements and carefully organized boycotts was poised, though nobody could have known it precisely at the time, to explode into the much larger, more visible movement of the following decade. The quiet, private dissatisfaction that so many housewives had been medicating with small pastel pills was about to find, in just a few short years, both a name and a voice, in a book that would sell in the millions and change the conversation permanently. Let's rest again for a moment here, gently, before we continue further into the night. I know we've covered an enormous amount of ground together, and there's still more ahead. The slow, uneven dismantling of the neighborhood covenants we discussed earlier, the way this decade's unresolved tensions would eventually reshape the following one, and finally, a quieter closing reflection on what it actually meant to live inside this particular decade, seen clearly, without the soft focus so often applied to it since. But for now, let your breathing settle, let your mind go quiet and rest here in the dark a while longer. We'll continue again very soon. Let's settle in once more. Let the room grow quiet around you, let your eyes rest, and let's continue walking this same street a little further into the decade, into corners we haven't yet touched. Let's begin tonight with something almost nobody in this era spoke about directly, even though nearly every household was quietly shaped by it: debt. The 1950s liked to present itself as an age of comfortable earned prosperity, the reward for a hard day's work and a well-managed household budget. But underneath that image was a financial system being fundamentally reinvented, one that would leave its fingerprints on American families for the rest of the century. Before this decade, buying most large items on credit was still considered faintly disreputable, a last resort for families who couldn't manage their money properly. By the time this decade was in full swing, that entire attitude had been quietly, deliberately reversed. Installment buying, paying for a refrigerator, a television set, a car, or eventually an entire house through a series of monthly payments stretched over years, became not just acceptable but actively encouraged, marketed as the responsible, modern way to build a life rather than a sign of financial trouble. Advertisements no longer asked whether a family could afford something outright. They asked whether a family could afford the monthly payment, a subtle but enormously consequential shift in how an entire generation was taught to think about money. The home mortgage itself, the very foundation of the suburban dream we've spent so much of tonight examining, was itself a relatively new kind of financial instrument for ordinary families, made widely accessible through federal programs established in the years just before and during this decade. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration both offered mortgage guarantees that made it possible for a family to buy a home with a much smaller down payment than had ever been available before, spread across a much longer repayment period than banks had traditionally offered. This was, in many respects, a genuine and remarkable expansion of opportunity. But it was an expansion built on the very same redlining maps we discussed earlier, available overwhelmingly to white families in approved neighborhoods, and it committed millions of households to decades of financial obligation in exchange for that suburban house with the two-car garage. Behind the cheerful kitchen full of gleaming new appliances, we spent an earlier evening exploring together sat, in a great many households, a quiet and growing weight of monthly payments, The refrigerator, the television, the car, the furniture, the house itself. Each one a small ongoing obligation that had to be met whether or not the breadwinner's overtime hours held steady, whether or not the factory kept running at full capacity, whether or not the economy remained as forgiving as it had been at the decade's start. Financial anxiety, like so much else in this era, was rarely discussed openly between neighbors, even as nearly everyone was quietly managing some version of the very same pressure, each family assuming, in the particular isolation the suburbs seemed to specialize in, that they alone were struggling to keep up with a lifestyle that looked, from the street, effortlessly comfortable. Let's turn now to the department store and the advertising agency, because the same forces reshaping how families borrowed money were also reshaping, with remarkable precision, how they thought and felt about almost everything else. This decade saw the advertising industry embrace, with real enthusiasm, insights borrowed directly from psychology, employing researchers trained in Freudian analysis and emerging consumer psychology to study not just what people said they wanted, but what they unconsciously, emotionally craved, and then building entire advertising campaigns around exploiting exactly that. Motivational research, as this new approach was often called, moved advertising away from simply describing a product's features and towards something far more sophisticated and, in retrospect, unsettling, selling an identity, a feeling, a fantasy of the person a buyer might become. A woman wasn't just buying a particular brand of cake mix. She was buying reassurance that she was a good mother, a good wife, someone fulfilling her purpose correctly. A man wasn't just buying a particular car. He was buying a tangible symbol of the very manhood and provider status that this decade insisted was the entire measure of his worth. These campaigns worked precisely because they tapped into anxieties the culture had already spent years carefully cultivating: the fear of not measuring up, of being judged by the neighbors, of failing quietly at a role that seemed, on the surface, so simple and so universally achieved by everyone else on the block. Television, still a genuinely new technology at the start of this decade, transformed this entire dynamic by bringing these carefully engineered messages directly into the living room, night after night, with a scale and intimacy that print advertising had never achieved. By the middle of the decade, the vast majority of American households owned a television set, and the average family spent several hours a day gathered around it, absorbing not just entertainment but a remarkably consistent, remarkably narrow vision of what a normal, successful American family was supposed to look like, sound like, and want. Sitcoms of the era, with their tidy, perfectly resolved half-hour conflicts and their impeccably dressed, endlessly patient mothers, offered a vision of domestic life so polished it bore only a passing resemblance to the actual households absorbing it. And yet, watched night after night, that polished vision quietly became the yardstick against which countless real families measured their own far messier, far more complicated lives, usually finding themselves coming up short. Let's move now toward the church pew, because faith occupied a central, almost civic role in this decade that can be difficult to fully appreciate from a more secular vantage point today. Religious observance surged throughout this period, church membership climbing to levels that would remain historic highs for the remainder of the century. And this surge was inseparable from the era's broader anxieties about communism, conformity, and moral order. To be openly irreligious in this decade wasn't simply a personal choice. It was viewed, in the context of the Cold War's ideological framing, as faintly suspicious, even unpatriotic, since official Soviet doctrine was explicitly atheist, which meant that American religiosity became, in the public imagination, a kind of moral bulwark against communism itself, a distinctly American virtue to be displayed as visibly and consistently as a well-mowed lawn. The phrase "under God" was formally added to the Pledge of Allegiance in the middle years of this decade, and "In God We Trust" became the country's official motto shortly afterward, both changes driven substantially by this same Cold War logic, an explicit, legislated effort to distinguish American identity from atheistic communism through religious language woven directly into the nation's civic rituals. Sunday church attendance, which we touched on in an earlier evening together, functioned as more than spiritual practice. It was a visible marker of belonging, of respectability, of the kind of family a community could trust, and a household that skipped church too often, for whatever private reason, risked the same quiet social scrutiny that governed so many other aspects of suburban life. Yet even within this outwardly unified religious landscape, real and sometimes painful divisions persisted underneath the surface. Catholic and Jewish families, despite decades of presence in American life, still faced meaningful social exclusion in many Protestant-dominated communities, barred informally from certain clubs, certain neighborhoods, certain unspoken social circles, their patriotism and belonging treated as something to be proven rather than assumed. Interfaith marriage, though slowly becoming somewhat more common as the decade progressed, still carried real social risk. Families on both sides sometimes refusing to attend weddings, relationships fracturing over a difference in religious background that the wider culture had trained everyone to treat as fundamentally important rather than simply personal. Let's turn now to the funeral parlor, because even the way this decade handled death and grief tells us something important about how carefully controlled and outwardly composed the entire culture demanded its emotional life to be. Death in the 1950s, much like mental illness, divorce, and financial struggle, was something to be managed discreetly, tastefully, and with as little visible disruption to ordinary life as possible. The funeral industry itself was rapidly professionalizing and expanding throughout this decade, moving death almost entirely out of the family home, where it had traditionally taken place for generations, and into the hands of specialized funeral parlors equipped to handle every detail with polished, practiced efficiency. Embalming, elaborate caskets, and carefully staged viewings became the expected standard rather than the exception, and grieving families were guided, gently but firmly, toward a version of mourning that prized composure and dignified restraint over any more visible or prolonged display of grief. Children were frequently shielded from death almost entirely, kept away from funerals, told vague, softened explanations about a grandparent who had simply gone to sleep or gone away. A well-intentioned but often deeply confusing approach that left many children without any real framework for understanding loss when it eventually, inevitably touched their own lives more directly. Widows, in particular, faced a strange and difficult set of expectations in this decade, expected to grieve visibly enough to demonstrate proper devotion to a departed husband, yet not so visibly or for so long that it became uncomfortable for those around her, expected to eventually remarry or at least present herself as available for remarriage, since a woman managing entirely on her own, especially given the financial and legal structures we discussed earlier tonight, was viewed as an anomaly the culture wasn't entirely sure how to accommodate. Life insurance, still a relatively new and expanding product for ordinary families during this era, became an increasingly common purchase for exactly this reason. A quiet acknowledgement, rarely spoken aloud at the dinner table, that a household's entire financial survival rested on one income, and that income's sudden absence needed some kind of practical safety net that the wider culture and legal system otherwise failed to provide. Let's turn, finally for tonight, toward the teenagers themselves, a group this decade seemed to simultaneously idolize and deeply fear, a tension we touched on briefly in an earlier evening, but one that deserves a fuller telling. The term juvenile delinquency entered mainstream American vocabulary with real force during this decade, driven by a genuine, if often wildly exaggerated, public anxiety that the country's youth were slipping into crime, immorality, and rebellion at an alarming rate. Congressional subcommittees held actual hearings investigating whether comic books, rock and roll music, and violent films were corrupting the nation's teenagers, treating adolescent restlessness with the same grave seriousness, usually reserved for genuine national security threats. Much of this fear, when examined closely, said considerably more about adult anxiety than it did about actual teenage behavior. This was, after all, the first American generation to be labeled and marketed to specifically as teenagers, a distinct consumer category with its own music, its own fashion, its own money to spend, thanks to the general prosperity of the era, and thanks to a general prosperity of the era. And adults, watching this entirely new cultural phenomenon unfold in real time, often struggled to distinguish between genuine delinquency and simply the ordinary, if newly visible, process of a generation finding its own identity separate from its parents. For the small number of teenagers who did find themselves in genuine trouble with the law, the juvenile justice system of this era offered little in the way of rehabilitation and a great deal in the way of punishment. Reform schools, as they were commonly called, varied enormously in quality, and a meaningful number of them, particularly institutions serving black and poor teenagers, were later revealed to have been sites of serious abuse and neglect, disguised behind the reassuring, corrective language the era preferred to use for anything uncomfortable it wished to keep out of sight. Let's pause here, gently, for the night's rest. We've walked a very long way together tonight, further than most evenings, through debt and advertising, through churches and funeral parlors, through the particular anxieties of a generation of teenagers learning to define themselves for the first time. There's still more ahead of us whenever you're ready to continue, the slow unraveling of those old neighborhood covenants, the bridge this decade built, however unevenly, into the decade that followed, and a final quiet reflection on everything we've uncovered together beneath this era's carefully polished surface. For now, let your breathing slow all the way down. Let the weight of the evening settle fully into the mattress beneath you, and rest. We'll pick the thread back up together very soon. Let's settle back in one more time. Let the mattress hold you a little heavier now. Let your eyelids grow a little slower to open again after each blink. And let's return to that same quiet street for what will be one of our longer walks together tonight. Let's begin with the immigrant families living just at the edges of the picture we've spent so many evenings examining, because the suburban ideal this decade sold so relentlessly was built with a very specific family in mind, and families who didn't quite fit that image, even white, European Christian families, often found themselves working twice as hard simply to be perceived as belonging at all. Italian, Polish, Greek, and other Eastern and Southern European immigrant communities, many of whom had arrived in the great waves of migration decades earlier and were now raising second or third generation American-born children, occupied a strange, shifting position in this decade's social hierarchy. They were legally white, and increasingly accepted as such in ways their grandparents had not been, yet they still carried, in the eyes of many older stock American families, a faint whiff of foreignness that had to be actively managed and minimized. Surnames were sometimes quietly shortened or anglicized, not through any legal requirement but through a kind of voluntary, exhausting self-editing, a family named Kowalski becoming Kelly on a job application, a family named Cohen finding certain neighborhoods and country clubs mysteriously, consistently unavailable to them regardless of income or credentials. Accents inherited from immigrant grandparents were often actively discouraged in the home, parents insisting that children speak only English, even to grandparents who understood little of it, out of a genuine, if painful, belief that fluency in the old language would mark their children as less than fully American in a decade that prized nothing more highly than fitting seamlessly into an undifferentiated, homogeneous whole. Jewish families in particular navigated this decade under its own specific and considerable weight. Antisemitism, while less overtly violent than it had been in earlier decades, remained deeply embedded in ordinary institutional life. Many universities maintained quiet, unofficial quotas limiting the number of Jewish students admitted each year, a practice that continued at several prestigious institutions well into this decade, despite never being formally acknowledged in any public policy. Corporate hearing at many major firms operated under similar unspoken understandings. Entire industries, particularly banking, law, and certain corners of manufacturing management, remaining almost entirely closed to Jewish applicants no matter how qualified, which pushed a disproportionate number of Jewish professionals of this era into medicine, into small business ownership, into building their own parallel institutions and firms precisely because the existing ones had made their exclusion, however politely, entirely clear. The neighborhood covenants we discussed several evenings ago frequently named Jewish families explicitly alongside black families as undesirable buyers, and the country clubs, the fraternal lodges, the more exclusive corners of suburban social life, often maintained their exclusions well past the point where anyone involved would have described themselves, out loud, as prejudiced in any way. Let's turn now to the Mexican American and broader Latino communities living through this decade, whose experience of American family life carried its own distinct and often painful contours, particularly in the southwestern states where their communities had, in many cases, been established for generations, in some instances longer than the American border itself had existed in its current form. This decade saw a federal immigration enforcement operation, carried out under a name so callous it's genuinely difficult to say without wincing, that resulted in the deportation of well over 1 million people, the overwhelming majority of Mexican descent, many of whom were, in fact, American citizens or legal permanent residents swept up in a chaotic, poorly supervised enforcement campaign that prioritized speed and visible numbers over any careful verification of who actually belonged on which side of a deportation order. Families were separated with little warning and even less due process. American-born children sometimes left behind with relatives, while a parent was removed to a country that, in some cases, the parent had not lived in for decades, if ever. For Mexican-American families who remained, school segregation operated through its own particular local logic in many southwestern communities. Children of Mexican descent frequently steered into separate, underfunded schools or separate classrooms within otherwise integrated schools, officially justified through language proficiency concerns that in practice applied regardless of whether a given child actually spoke Spanish as a first language at all. Corporal punishment for speaking Spanish on school grounds, even during casual conversation on the playground, was a documented and disturbingly common practice in numerous districts throughout this decade, an explicit, painful lesson in which language, which culture, which identity was considered acceptable within the walls of an American classroom. Let's move now toward a quieter, more private corner of family life this decade rarely discussed directly at all: aging, and the particular new arrangement this era was quietly inventing for what happened to a person once they grew too old to fully care for themselves. For most of American history before this decade, aging parents had typically remained within the extended family structure, living with an adult child, cared for through a shared, if often strained, multi-generational household. This decade, with its emphasis on the small, self-contained nuclear family, its brand new suburban houses built with exactly enough bedrooms for parents and children and no one else, began to quietly unravel that older arrangement. And the nursing home industry, still relatively new and rapidly expanding throughout this period, emerged to fill the gap that a changing family structure was leaving behind. These early nursing homes and old-age facilities varied enormously in quality, largely unregulated by any consistent federal or even state standard until later decades. And for a meaningful number of elderly residents, the experience of these institutions was one of genuine isolation, tucked away from the busy, forward-looking suburban life the rest of the family was building, visited with a frequency that, in a great many documented family accounts from this era, dwindled steadily over time. The cultural conversation around aging in this decade carried its own particular discomfort, a society so thoroughly obsessed with youth, modernity, and the gleaming promise of the future, finding remarkably little vocabulary or genuine interest for honoring the people who had actually lived through the decades that made that promised future possible. Let's turn now toward the slow, uneven unraveling of the very neighborhood covenants we spent an earlier evening examining in such careful detail. Because by the later years of this decade, the legal and social architecture of suburban exclusion was beginning, gradually and against enormous resistance, to show its first real cracks. Though the Supreme Court had already ruled explicit racial covenants unenforceable in the courts back in 1948, the practical work of actually integrating suburban communities built on that earlier foundation of exclusion moved at an agonizingly slow pace throughout this entire decade, met at nearly every turn by informal but remarkably effective resistance from developers, real estate agents, lending institutions, and often the residents themselves. A small number of black families who did manage, against considerable odds, to purchase homes in previously all-white suburban developments during this decade, often found that legal victory came with a very steep and very real social cost. Documented cases from across the country describe crosses burned on newly purchased lawns, windows broken, threatening notes left on doorsteps, organized boycotts by white neighbors against local businesses that had assisted the sale, and in a number of instances, sustained campaigns of harassment severe enough that families ultimately chose to sell and leave rather than continue enduring it. These weren't isolated incidents confined to any single region. They occurred in suburbs across the North and Midwest just as readily as anywhere in the South, a quiet, uncomfortable reminder that this decade's particular brand of exclusion was never simply a regional phenomenon, but something woven deeply into the fabric of post-war suburban development as a national project. And yet, even against this resistance, the first genuine cracks were forming. A small but growing number of white families throughout this decade, motivated by everything from genuine conviction to simple economic pragmatism, chose to sell homes to black buyers despite social pressure not to. Fair housing advocacy organizations, still small and often struggling for resources and recognition throughout this period, were laying groundwork that would eventually contribute to federal fair housing legislation passed later in the following decade. The seeds of the legal and social changes that would eventually, slowly, unevenly begin dismantling this architecture of exclusion were being planted throughout these years, even if the actual harvest remained, for most of the decade, frustratingly and painfully distant for the families most directly affected. Let's pause here, gently, and let the weight of everything we've walked through settle over you a little more heavily now. Feel how far into the night we've traveled together, how much of this decade's quiet architecture we've now uncovered, piece by piece, room by room, family by family. There's still a little more ground ahead of us, the way this decade's unresolved tensions would carry directly into the tumult of the one that followed, and a final, quieter reflection to close our evening together. But for now, let your body sink further into the mattress. Let your thoughts slow to something closer to drifting than thinking, and rest here a while. We'll continue again very soon. Let's settle back in one final time for tonight. Let your body go heavy against the mattress. Let the room around you fade a little further into softness, and let's walk the last long stretch of this street together before we finally let the night close over us completely. Let's begin this closing chapter with something that touched nearly every household on this street in one form or another, whether they spoke of it openly or, far more often, didn't speak of it at all. The particular burden carried by families raising a child who had arrived, quite unexpectedly, outside the tidy timeline the decade insisted every family should follow. We touched briefly, several evenings ago, on the maternity homes built specifically to manage unmarried pregnancy. But there's a wider, quieter story here too, one that played out inside marriages themselves, in households where a wedding had technically preceded a birth by only a matter of months, an arithmetic that neighbors performed instinctively and discussed only in the most careful, coded language over backyard fences. A young couple who married quickly, quietly, sometimes with far less ceremony than either family had originally imagined, often carried the weight of that quiet calculation for years afterward, even as the marriage itself settled into the same rhythms as any other on the block. The child born from such a match grew up, in many documented family accounts from this era, absorbing a version of this story only in fragments: an aunt's slightly too-pointed comment at a holiday dinner, a photograph album with a wedding date that never quite seemed to align with a birthday the way the child had always assumed it should, a silence that settled over the subject the moment it was raised directly. Family reputations in this decade were remarkably durable things, capable of absorbing and burying a great deal of complicated human reality beneath a surface that simply refused, for decades at a stretch, to ever fully explain itself. Let's turn now toward another quiet corner of domestic life, this decade rarely examined honestly: infertility, and the particular loneliness it created inside a culture that had built almost the entirety of a woman's identity and social value around her capacity to become a mother. A woman who married and did not become pregnant within what the culture considered a reasonable window found herself subjected to a steady, exhausting stream of questions, some gently curious, many considerably less gentle, from relatives, from neighbors, from her own bridge club companions. Each inquiry landing with the particular sting of a pain she was rarely given any real space to discuss honestly. Medical understanding of infertility in this decade remained limited, and treatment options limited further still, meaning that couples facing this struggle often received little in the way of genuine medical guidance and a great deal in the way of folk remedies, well-meaning but unhelpful advice, and an undercurrent of implied blame that fell, with grim consistency, far more heavily on the wife than the husband, regardless of where the actual underlying cause might have lain. Adoption existed as an option throughout this decade, though the process itself operated under its own particular set of rigid, often invasive expectations. Adoption agencies frequently scrutinizing a prospective mother's household management, her church attendance, her husband's income and temperament, with an intensity that biological parents, by simple virtue of biology, were never subjected to at all. Couples who never did become parents, whether by choice or by circumstance beyond their control, often found themselves gently but persistently pushed to the margins of a suburban social world built almost entirely around children, their childless status treated less as a private circumstance, and more as a subject requiring constant, if delicately phrased, explanation. Let's move now toward the particular experience of military families during this decade, a group whose domestic life carried its own distinct rhythms and its own distinct burdens, shaped by a Cold War that demanded constant readiness even in years without any officially declared American war. Military wives in this era, and it was overwhelmingly wives managing this particular arrangement, often relocated with startling frequency, sometimes every year or two, uprooting children from schools and friendships just as they'd begun to settle, rebuilding an entire social network from nothing in each new posting, all while a husband's actual schedule and availability remained subject to orders that could arrive with very little advance warning. The Korean War, fought through the first several years of this decade, though frequently overshadowed in popular memory by the two world wars that preceded it, and the war in Vietnam that would follow, nonetheless sent well over 1 million American men into a brutal conflict that would ultimately claim tens of thousands of American lives, wounding many times that number, physically and psychologically both. Families who lost a husband, a father, a son in this conflict navigated their grief within a culture, as we discussed at length several evenings ago, remarkably unequipped to process loss openly, made only more complicated by a war that many Americans, even at the time, struggled to fully understand or articulate the purpose of. A war that would come to be known, with a certain quiet bitterness among the families who lived through it, as the Forgotten War. Overshadowed in the national memory almost from the moment it ended, let's turn now to something that touched families of every background across this entire decade, quietly, persistently, in ways the culture had almost no adequate framework for addressing: the particular grief of miscarriage and infant loss. Medical care in this era, while advancing rapidly in many respects, still could not prevent a rate of miscarriage and infant mortality considerably higher than what families would come to expect in later decades. And the cultural response to this loss, much like the cultural response to death more broadly that we examined several evenings ago, prized brevity and composure over any extended, visible period of mourning. A woman who experienced a miscarriage in this decade was frequently discouraged, sometimes by well-meaning doctors and relatives alike, from speaking of the loss at all, encouraged instead to simply try again as soon as medically advisable, the unspoken assumption being that a subsequent successful pregnancy would resolve the grief entirely, an assumption that generations of women who lived through this exact experience would later describe. Once the culture finally developed enough vocabulary to ask them honestly, as fundamentally, painfully mistaken, stillbirth carried its own particular silence, hospitals in this era frequently whisking a stillborn infant away before a mother had any opportunity to hold the child, operating under a medical philosophy that believed, with what later generations would recognize as a genuine misunderstanding of grief itself, that minimizing contact would somehow minimize the resulting sorrow. Headstones for infants who died in this decade, when families could afford them at all, sometimes carried only a single first name and a single date, a small, permanent marker of a loss the wider culture had otherwise trained an entire generation of parents to carry forward largely in silence. Let's turn, finally, toward a broader reflection on where this decade's particular tensions actually led, because history rarely closes as neatly as any single year on a calendar might suggest. And the story we've spent so many evenings walking through together didn't simply end when this decade gave way to the next. The quiet dissatisfaction we traced through countless housewives, the pastel tranquilizers, and the problem with no name would find its published voice at the very start of the following decade, in a book that sold in the millions and gave an entire generation of women permission, for the first time in a very long while, to say out loud what they had been feeling privately for years. The civil rights movement, built so patiently in church basements and carpool networks throughout this decade, would erupt into the much larger, more visible marches and legislative battles of the years that followed, carrying forward the courage of the Montgomery boycotters, the Little Rock Nine, and countless other families whose names never made it into any textbook at all. The labor protections so carefully negotiated throughout this decade would continue to shape, and eventually to strain, the American economy for decades afterward. The suburban architecture of exclusion, built so deliberately through covenants and redlining and blockbusting, would prove remarkably durable, its consequences still visible in the shape of American cities and neighborhoods generations later, long after the explicit legal mechanisms that created it had finally been dismantled. And the children of this decade, the ones who grew up behind those pressed collars and starched dresses, who absorbed the silences at the dinner table, and the particular weight of never quite asking the questions that seemed to unsettle their parents most, would grow into the adults of the following decades carrying all of it forward with them, some determined to recreate the exact same quiet order they'd been raised inside, and many others determined, with an intensity that would help define an entire era of American cultural upheaval, to tear that quiet order down and build something honest in its place. So what do we make of it, this decade so carefully remembered as simple and safe, seen now with its full weight laid bare across the evening we've spent together? Perhaps the truest thing that can be said is this: the people living through it were not, for the most part, cruel or foolish or blind. They were doing precisely what nearly every generation does, making the best sense they could of the world and the rules they'd inherited, building what comfort and order they were able to build within a system that had been constructed, often deliberately, to make that comfort available to some families and quietly, persistently unavailable to others. The lawns were real. The kitchens were real. The love between parents and children, however imperfectly expressed through a culture that gave them so little language for expressing it at all, was real too. But so was the loneliness behind the kitchen curtains, the fear behind the bedroom door, the silence pressed down over grief and difference and pain that this decade simply had no acceptable place to put. History remembers this era so often as simple. It rarely was. It was built, quietly and carefully, by millions of ordinary people doing their very best within a set of rules that asked an enormous amount of them, and offered remarkably little room for anyone who didn't fit neatly inside the frame. And perhaps that's the gentlest, truest way to close this particular story tonight. Not with judgment, and not with nostalgia either, but simply with the quiet, patient act of finally looking closely at what was actually there, all along, just beneath the surface of every perfectly mowed lawn. Let your breathing settle now, all the way down. Let the weight of this long, quiet evening finally rest fully over you. We've walked the whole length of this street together tonight, through kitchens and classrooms, through church pews and factory floors, through every quiet room this decade tried so carefully to keep closed. It's all right to let it all go now, to let the story settle into the back of your mind the way a house settles into its foundation after a long day, and to simply rest here, safe, in your own bed, decades removed from all of it. Good night.